History has a way of remembering the conquerors, the kings, and the rulers whose names echo through the ages. But what about those who worked in the shadows, whose brilliance and bravery shaped the world just as profoundly, yet were never celebrated in the grand narratives? Picture this: an inventor whose forgotten machine laid the groundwork for modern engineering, a diplomat whose quiet negotiations prevented wars that could have rewritten entire civilizations, or a healer whose remedies saved thousands but were lost to time. These are the unsung heroes of antiquity, the ones who changed everything without ever demanding the spotlight. And today, we're bringing their stories out of the shadows. Think about the ancient world, the pyramids, the great libraries, the sprawling empires, and then ask yourself, how many of the people who actually built those wonders do you know by name? For every pharaoh or emperor who took credit, there were countless others whose ingenuity and courage made those achievements possible. Some of them were women who defied the limits of their time. Others were enslaved individuals who carved out freedom through sheer determination. And then there were the visionaries whose ideas were so ahead of their time that history nearly erased them completely. Their legacies are hidden in the cracks of time, waiting to be rediscovered. This isn't just a journey into the past, it's a revelation of how much we've overlooked. These 20 little-known heroes didn't just play a role in history, they rewrote it. Their inventions, their sacrifices, their refusal to accept the impossible, these are the threads that wove the fabric of the ancient world as we know it. And yet, their names are barely whispers in the wind. Why? Because history, as it's often told, favors the loudest voices. But today, that changes. Together, we'll uncover the astonishing truths behind these forgotten figures, and you'll walk away wondering how the world ever managed to forget them in the first place. Ready to meet the minds and hearts that quietly shaped eternity? Let's begin. What truly separates these overlooked figures from the towering names of antiquity? It's not just that their stories faded, it's that their work was so foundational, so seamlessly woven into the fabric of history, that later generations took their contributions for granted. Consider the architect who designed the first arches to support Rome's aqueducts, a breakthrough so revolutionary that we still use the principle today, yet no one remembers their name. Or the scribe who meticulously preserved fragile texts during wartime, ensuring entire philosophies survived when conquerors burned libraries. Their anonymity wasn't an accident, it was often by design. Take the case of ancient medicine. While Hippocrates gets the credit, countless healers, many of them women, developed treatments using herbs and surgeries long before the so-called father of medicine. Their knowledge was dismissed as folk wisdom, even as it saved lives. Or think of the enslaved engineers who built monuments like the Parthenon, their craftsmanship unmatched, yet their identities erased by the very societies that relied on them. These weren't mere footnotes, they were visionaries whose absence from the historical record says more about who held power than who shaped it. The irony. Some of these heroes were known in their time, only to be written out later. A diplomat who brokered peace between warring city-states might have been celebrated briefly until new rulers rewrote history to glorify themselves. A mathematician whose calculations mapped the stars could have their work attributed to a more respectable figure centuries later. That's why uncovering their stories isn't just about giving credit, it's about correcting the lens through which we view the past. Every time we rediscover one of these figures, we're reminded that history isn't a single narrative carved in stone, but a mosaic of countless hands, many of which were never allowed to sign their work. Imagine a man so brilliant that centuries after his death, the Egyptians worshipped him as a god, not a pharaoh born into power, but a commoner who earned immortality through sheer genius. That man was Imhotep, the visionary behind Egypt's first pyramid, the Step Pyramid of Djoser, a structure so revolutionary it changed architecture forever. But here's what most history books leave out. Imhotep wasn't just an architect, he was a polymath, a master of medicine, astronomy, and even governance, whose ideas were so far ahead of their time that they still echo today. How did a man from humble origins rise to become the right hand of a pharaoh? Imhotep's story begins with a breakthrough that seems simple but was earth-shattering for its time. He figured out how to build with stone. Before him, Egyptian monuments were made of mud brick, ephemeral, crumbling. But Imhotep saw potential in limestone, crafting it into blocks so precise they fit together without mortar, creating structures meant to last eternity. The Step Pyramid wasn't just a tomb, it was a declaration that human ambition could defy time itself, and yet his engineering prowess was just the beginning. While others focused on the afterlife, Imhotep studied the living. His medical texts, later admired even by the Greeks, described treatments for diseases with startling accuracy. He diagnosed ailments, set broken bones, and prescribed remedies based on observation, not magic or superstition. In an era when illness was often seen as divine punishment, Imhotep dared to believe it could be understood, even cured. His approach was so groundbreaking that later generations merged his legacy with Asclepius, the Greek god of healing, blurring the line between man and deity. But perhaps his most enduring legacy was the way he redefined what it meant to serve a kingdom. As vizier, Imhotep didn't just build monuments, he built systems. He reformed Egypt's bureaucracy, ensuring grain was stored for famines and justice was more than just a pharaoh's whim. In a world where power was hoarded, he believed knowledge should be shared, training scribes and healers to spread his innovations far beyond the royal court. That's why his deification isn't just a footnote, it's proof that ancient Egypt recognized greatness, even when it didn't wear a crown. So why isn't Imhotep as famous as the pharaohs he served? Because history often favors the rulers, not the minds that made their reigns possible. His name might not echo like Ramses or Cleopatra's, but his fingerprints are everywhere, in the curve of an arch, the pages of a medical text, the very idea that genius can come from anywhere. Imhotep's story isn't just about the past. It's a reminder that the future belongs to those who dare to rethink the possible, regardless of where they start. And that's a legacy no pyramid could ever contain. While kings waged wars with swords, Enheduanna fought battles with words. As the daughter of Sargon the Great, founder of the Akkadian Empire, she could have relied on her father's armies to enforce control. Instead, she chose a far more enduring weapon: poetry. Appointed high priestess of Enheduanna became the world's first named author, but her hymns were more than literary triumphs. They were masterstrokes of political genius. In a land fractured by rival city-states, each with its own gods and loyalties, she composed sacred texts that merged Sumerian and Akkadian deities into a single pantheon. Imagine the audacity. Where conquerors demanded submission through force, she offered unity through shared belief, transforming cultural differences into threads of a common tapestry. Her most famous work, The Exaltation of Inanna, wasn't just a devotional poem, it was a diplomatic blueprint. By elevating the Sumerian goddess Inanna alongside Akkadian divinities, she gave both peoples a stake in the empire's spiritual identity. This wasn't mere symbolism, it was strategic brilliance. When rebellions erupted, her hymns traveled farther than soldiers ever could, carried by priests and merchants into the hearts of resistant cities. Temples became stages for her verses, where warring factions knelt before the same altars, whispering the same prayers. In a time when empires often crumbled under the weight of cultural resentment, Enheduanna's words became the glue that held Sargon's realm together. Yet her legacy faced near erasure. Later rulers, eager to claim divine authority for themselves, downplayed her role, attributing her hymns to anonymous tradition. Even her name vanished for millennia, buried in broken clay tablets until modern archaeologists pieced together the truth. The irony, those who tried to erase her only proved her point. By weaving Akkadian and Sumerian traditions so seamlessly, she made her work untouchable, too deeply embedded in both cultures to discard. Today, we recognize her not just as a poet but as a pioneer of soft power, a reminder that the pen can outlast the sword when wielded with vision. What makes her story so urgent now is how it challenges our assumptions about power. We remember Sargon's conquests, but it was Enheduanna's quiet diplomacy that gave his empire longevity. While others ruled through fear, she understood that true influence comes from speaking to shared hopes, not just imposing demands. Her hymns didn't just prevent wars, they redefined what it meant to win one. In a world still grappling with cultural divisions, her ancient strategy whispers a timeless lesson. Sometimes the most revolutionary act isn't domination, it's making enemies see themselves in each other. Hidden behind the fame of Pythagoras and his iconic theorem stood a mind just as brilliant, Thino, his student, collaborator, and eventual successor. While history remembers Pythagoras for triangles, Thino's work on the golden mean, the divine proportion that balances symmetry and beauty, became the invisible foundation of everything from Greek temples to Renaissance art. But here's the twist: she wasn't just refining his ideas, she was revolutionizing them, proving that mathematics wasn't just about numbers, it was about harmony, philosophy, and even the soul. How did a woman in 6th century BC Greece rise to lead one of the most prestigious schools of the ancient world? Thino's story begins with a radical idea, that knowledge had no gender. While most women were excluded from intellectual circles, Pythagoras' academy welcomed her, recognizing a talent too extraordinary to ignore. But her true breakthrough came after his death, when she took the helm of the school, guiding disciples through complex theories while challenging societal norms simply by standing at the front of the room. Her lectures weren't just lessons, they were quiet rebellions. The golden mean, her crowning contribution, was more than a mathematical ratio. It was a bridge between science and art, a principle that shaped everything from the Parthenon's columns to the curves of classical sculptures. Architects and artists sought this perfect balance, often unaware it was Thino who had codified its rules. Yet her influence didn't stop there. She wrote treatises on medicine, physics, and even child-rearing, insisting that rationality and compassion were intertwined, a philosophy centuries ahead of its time. Why then was her name nearly lost? Because history often credits institutions, not individuals, especially when those individuals were women. Later scholars attributed her work to Pythagoras or male successors, erasing her voice from the record. Even today, we're left to piece together her legacy from fragments, a mention here, a citation there, but the truth lingers in the numbers. The golden mean didn't just shape ancient aesthetics, it became a universal language of balance, one that whispers Thino's name in the geometry of sunflowers, the spiral of seashells, and the very patterns of nature itself. Her story forces us to ask, how many other Thinos were there? How many minds, dismissed or forgotten, laid the groundwork for what we call a genius? Thino didn't just solve equations, she shattered assumptions, proving that intellectual greatness isn't bound by era or gender. And in doing so, she left us a theorem far more profound than any right angle. That progress, in the end, belongs to those brave enough to think beyond the limits of their time. When we think of slave revolts against Rome, Spartacus instantly comes to mind, but decades before his legendary uprising, another leader proved just how formidable organized resistance could be. Eunus of Sicily wasn't just a rebel, he was a visionary who turned desperation into strategy, uniting enslaved people from Syria to Greece under a single banner. What made his revolt extraordinary wasn't just its scale, it was the way he weaponized something Rome never expected: faith. A former mystic, Eunus convinced his followers that the gods had chosen him to overthrow their oppressors, weaving spiritual authority into military tactics in ways that left even seasoned Roman generals baffled. His first masterstroke was recognizing division as Rome's greatest tool. Enslaved people in Sicily came from dozens of cultures, speaking different languages and worshipping different gods. Where others saw chaos, Eunus saw potential. He didn't demand assimilation. He created a shared identity, declaring that the Syrian goddess Agnotis had promised victory to all who joined him. This wasn't mere propaganda, it was psychological warfare. By framing the revolt as divinely ordained, he gave people from disparate backgrounds a common purpose stronger than fear. Soon, thousands flocked to his side, not as Syrians or Greeks, but as warriors of liberation. The rebellion's success lay in its adaptability. While Spartacus's forces clashed directly with legions, Eunus played a longer game. His fighters seized Sicilian estates not just for plunder but to establish self-sustaining communities, minting their own coins and distributing food to the enslaved still toiling on nearby plantations. This wasn't just rebellion, it was state-building, a blueprint for how marginalized people could reclaim autonomy. For 2 years, his forces outmaneuvered Rome, using Sicily's rugged terrain to ambush reinforcements while winning over rural poor who'd suffered under wealthy landowners. Yet Eunus's greatest innovation was his understanding of spectacle. Before battles, he'd breathe fire by hiding combustible nuts in his mouth, a trick that cemented his aura of invincibility. Roman historians, eager to dismiss him as a charlatan, missed the genius behind the theatrics. He wasn't just inspiring his army, he was terrifying enemies who believed they faced a man touched by the divine. When Rome finally crushed the revolt, they made sure to erase his legacy, burying accounts of his tactical brilliance beneath tales of barbarism. So why does Spartacus overshadow him? Because Rome needed a cautionary tale, not a case study in their own vulnerability. Eunus proved that unity could flourish even among the oppressed, that faith could be as sharp as any sword. His revolt wasn't just a fight for freedom, it was a preview of every grassroots movement to come, where the marginalized rewrite the rules of power, and that's a story no empire once remembered. Athens in the 4th century BCE was a city of philosophers and poets, but for women it was also a cage. The law was clear: no woman could practice medicine, especially not gynecology. The punishment for breaking this rule, death. Yet in this oppressive climate, one young woman refused to accept that her gender made her unworthy to heal. Agnotis dared what no one else would. She cut her hair, donned men's clothing, and walked into the male-dominated world of medicine as a man. But her disguise wasn't just about survival, it was a calculated act of rebellion. By apprenticing under the renowned physician Herophilus, she didn't just learn to treat patients, she mastered the art of subversion. What set Agnotis apart wasn't just her skill, but her empathy. While male doctors often dismissed women's pain as hysteria, she listened. Word spread among the women of Athens. There was a male physician who actually understood their suffering. Soon, her reputation grew so strong that it became her undoing. When rival doctors, jealous of her success, accused her of seducing female patients, Agnotis faced an impossible choice: reveal her identity and face execution, or let innocent women suffer. In a courtroom crowded with hostile faces, she did the unthinkable. She tore open her tunic. The gasp that followed wasn't just shock, it was the sound of an entire society confronting its own hypocrisy. The trial that followed shook Athens to its core. The male physicians demanded her death, but their argument crumbled when an unexpected army arrived at the courthouse. Agnodis's patients, noble women who refused to let their healer be silenced. Their defiance forced the courts to reckon with a truth they'd long ignored. Women's health required women's hands. The law was rewritten not out of kindness, but because the alternative, losing the city's most skilled gynecologist, was unthinkable. Yet even in victory, Agnodis's name was nearly erased. Later historians, uncomfortable with her transgressive legacy, downplayed her story or folded it into myth. Why does her struggle resonate today? Because Agnotis wasn't just fighting for her right to work. She was challenging the very idea that some voices matter less than others. Every time a woman in medicine faces skepticism or a gender pay gap lingers, her story whispers across the centuries: progress isn't given, it's taken. And sometimes it takes someone willing to risk everything, not just for a seat at the table, but to smash the table entirely and build a new one. Her legacy isn't just in the lives she saved, but in the cracks she left in the walls, meant to keep women out, cracks that others would widen into doorways. Long before European ships dreamed of rounding Africa, a Phoenician admiral named Hanno set sail from Carthage with 60 vessels, their sails taut with ambition. His mission wasn't just trade, it was the unknown. While most ancient mariners clung to coastal waters, Hanno dared to venture beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the Atlantic's uncharted expanse. What he recorded would stretch the limits of the known world: volcanoes lighting the night sky, rivers thick with hippopotamuses, and shores teeming with creatures his crew could only describe as hairy men. These weren't myths scribbled for entertainment. They were meticulous logs, the first written account of sub-Saharan Africa's western coast. Yet for centuries, scholars dismissed his periplus as fantasy, a sailor's tall tale. Why? Because Hanno's truth was too extraordinary for a world that hadn't yet learned to dream so boldly. The brilliance of his voyage lay in its pragmatism. Unlike later explorers who sought glory or conquest, Hanno was solving a practical problem. Carthage needed new trade routes to outmaneuver Greek rivals. His fleet carried not just sailors but colonists, establishing settlements along the Moroccan coast that became hubs for gold, ivory, and exotic woods. But what began as commerce soon became discovery. When his ships reached the Senegal River, they found not just markets but ecosystems utterly alien to Mediterranean eyes. His descriptions of gorillas, mistakenly called hairy women by translators, marked the first recorded encounter between Europeans and primates. Yet this detail was later twisted into legend, proof to skeptics that his entire account was fiction. The real tragedy of Hanno's legacy isn't just that his achievements were doubted, it's how that doubt shaped history. When Greek geographers like Herodotus referenced his journey, they did so with raised eyebrows, framing his discoveries as speculative rather than factual. By the time Rome rose to power, his periplus was relegated to the realm of folklore, a casualty of Mediterranean bias against Phoenician sources. Yet modern archaeology keeps vindicating him. The ruins of his coastal settlements have been found, their Phoenician pottery silent testimony to his presence. The burning land he described, likely Mount Caculuma in Guinea, its active fires matching his descriptions perfectly. Even his hairy men align with chimpanzee behavior observed centuries later. Hanno's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. exploration isn't just about who reaches a place first, but whose account gets taken seriously. His voyage didn't just map new lands, it revealed how easily knowledge can be erased when it comes from the wrong civilization. While Columbus gets credit for discovering a continent already inhabited by millions, Hanno's meticulous documentation was brushed aside because it didn't fit the narrative of who gets to be an explorer. His legacy isn't just in the coasts he charted, but in the warning he left us. History belongs not to those who see, but to those who are seen. And sometimes the most revolutionary visionaries are the ones we're taught to ignore. While Archimedes gets the glory for shouting Eureka, in his bathtub, another mind was quietly revolutionizing the ancient world's understanding of mechanics. Philo of Byzantium, a man who turned water into wonder. Picture this, a theater where tiny automated actors performed entire plays, powered by hidden systems of weights, pulleys, and hydraulics. Or imagine a siege engine so precise it could hurl boulders with terrifying accuracy, all thanks to his innovations in compressed air. Philo didn't just build machines, he wove magic into engineering, creating devices that blurred the line between science and spectacle. His most famous work, the Pneumatica, wasn't just a technical manual, it was a manifesto on the poetry of motion. Where others saw gears and levers as mere tools, Philo recognized their potential to astonish. One of his creations, a self-regulating water vessel, used siphons and counterweights to maintain a constant water level, a principle later adapted in Renaissance fountains. Another device, a wind-powered organ, transformed gusts of air into music centuries before the first player piano. These weren't just clever gadgets, they were proof that engineering could be as expressive as any art form. Yet Philo's genius extended beyond entertainment. His designs for defensive catapults revolutionized warfare, introducing torsion springs that made siege weapons faster and deadlier. Cities across the Mediterranean adopted his blueprints, often without knowing the mind behind them. Even more remarkably, his work on water clocks introduced the concept of feedback mechanisms, an idea so advanced it wouldn't resurface until the Industrial Revolution. The irony, while his inventions spread far and wide, his name faded into footnotes, overshadowed by flashier figures like Archimedes. So why does history overlook him? Because Philo's legacy was buried in the quiet hum of machinery, not the dramatic arcs of war or politics. His treatises were copied and recopied, stripped of attribution until they became anonymous common knowledge. Renaissance inventors like Leonardo da Vinci studied his pneumatic principles, unaware they were standing on the shoulders of a Byzantine giant. Even today, we encounter echoes of his work in everything from automatic doors to modern robotics, yet few realize these ideas sprang from a mind 2,000 years ahead of its time. Philo's story challenges our obsession with fame as the measure of genius. His creations didn't need a spotlight to change the world. They simply worked, hidden in the gears of history, turning long after his name was forgotten. In a culture that glorifies lone inventors and eureka moments, he reminds us that progress often flows like water, silent, relentless, and far greater than any single hand that guides it. And perhaps that's the most profound invention of all, the understanding that brilliance doesn't always need a name to leave its mark. In the bustling courts of ancient India, where silk merchants and temple priests came to settle disputes, one voice cut through the noise with startling clarity: Vishaka, a magistrate whose rulings didn't just interpret the law but redefined it. While most legal minds of her era focused on property or trade, she turned her attention to a far more radical subject: the rights of women in the workplace. Picture this: a female potter, denied wages equal to her male peers, stands before Vishaka's bench. The guild leaders argue tradition favors men. Vishaka counters with something revolutionary evidence. She audits ledgers, exposes the disparity, and decrees that skill, not gender, determines pay. It was a verdict that sent shockwaves through the guild halls of the subcontinent, yet today, her name is barely a whisper in legal history. What made Vishakha's approach so transformative was her understanding of power. She didn't just punish offenders, she dismantled the systems that enabled injustice. When temple priestesses faced harassment, she didn't merely remove the perpetrators, she drafted binding codes requiring separate changing quarters and female overseers in sacred spaces. These weren't suggestions, they were enforceable laws, complete with fines and public censure for violators. Her most famous ruling, the Vishaka Guidelines, mandated that workplaces provide safe passage home for women working night shifts, a concept so ahead of its time that modern India wouldn't see similar protections until the late 20th century. Yet her legacy faced deliberate erasure. Later dynasties, eager to assert patriarchal control, scrubbed her judgments from official records, dismissing them as women's whims. Brahminical texts reduced her to a footnote, framing gender equity as foreign to Indian tradition, despite her rulings being rooted in Hindu Shastra's own principles of fairness. The irony, Vishakha's ideas survived precisely because they worked. Temple inscriptions and merchant contracts quietly adopted her standards, preserving them in practice if not in name. Even the Kama Sutra, often misread as purely a text on pleasure, cites her rulings on consent in workplace relationships, proving her influence seeped into unexpected corners of culture. Why does her story matter now? Because Vishakha proved that equality isn't a modern invention, it's a battleground as old as civilization itself. Her courtroom wasn't just a place of judgment, it was a forge where she hammered out a vision of justice that refused to treat half of humanity as afterthoughts. The guilds and temples that resisted her at first eventually flourished under her reforms, discovering what she'd known all along: fairness isn't just moral, it's practical. When we talk about workplace harassment laws today, we're not stepping forward into progress, we're stepping back into a conversation Vishakha began millennia ago. And that's the mark of a true legal pioneer, not just changing the rules, but ensuring they're too indispensable to forget. The Rosetta Stone gets all the glory for unlocking Egypt's secrets, but the real hero wasn't the artifact itself. It was the scribe who understood the power of words to hold empires together. Meet Horweneffer, the Ptolemaic official whose bureaucratic genius turned translation into a tool of unity. While kings waged wars to control Egypt, he waged a quieter battle, standardizing the first true bilingual administration in history. His system didn't just bridge Greek and Egyptian, it gave both cultures equal footing in law, trade, and governance, transforming language from a barrier into glue. Horweneffer's breakthrough wasn't merely technical, it was psychological. Previous rulers had imposed Greek as the language of power, alienating native Egyptians. But he designed something radical. Parallel documents where neither script dominated. A tax decree in Greek didn't hover above its Demotic counterpart. They stood side by side, identical in authority. This subtle visual balance sent an unmistakable message. No language was subordinate. Temples adopted his format for sacred texts. Merchants used it for contracts, and suddenly, a society on the brink of fracture found common ground in ink and papyrus. The scribe's true mastery lay in the details, where others translated word for word, creating clumsy, confusing texts. Horweneffer trained bilingual scribes to convey meaning, not just vocabulary. A Greek legal concept might not exist in Egyptian, so his teams would find equivalent phrases, preserving intent across cultures. His scribble schools became engines of cultural exchange, where Greek administrators learned hieroglyphic etiquette and Egyptian priests debated Greek philosophy. The result, a bureaucracy so seamless that petitions could switch languages mid-sentence without losing clarity, a feat modern governments still struggle to achieve. Yet history nearly erased him. Later scholars, obsessed with the Rosetta Stone's decipherment, overlooked the human mind behind its purpose. Even today, museums display bilingual decrees as linguistic curiosities, not political tools. But the proof is in the parchment. Under Horweneffer's system, Egypt weathered rebellions that toppled other Hellenistic kingdoms, because when people see their voice reflected in power, they're less likely to burn it down. His legacy whispers a timeless lesson. The pen might not be mightier than the sword, but it's often the reason the sword stays sheathed. What makes his story so urgent now is how it reframes our view of ancient politics. We remember conquerors and monuments, but Horweneffer proves real stability often comes from the clerks, not the kings. In a world still fractured by language barriers, his work challenges us to ask, how many modern conflicts stem not from irreconcilable differences, but from the arrogance of assuming one culture's words should tower over another's? The answer might just lie in the quiet genius of a scribe who knew that to rule an empire, you must first speak its people's hearts. King Ashoka's reign is often celebrated for its rock-carved edicts preaching nonviolence, but few realize those same stones hid a quieter revolution, one that reshaped the land itself. While Ashoka declared protection for forests and wildlife, his chief advisor Gopala was turning those ideals into engineering marvels. Imagine a city where monsoon rains didn't mean floods or drought, but a carefully choreographed dance of water. That was Gopala's vision, a network of stepped wells, underground channels, and rooftop reservoirs so precise they could sustain millions without stripping a single river dry. His designs didn't just prevent ecological disaster, they anticipated it, proving sustainability isn't a modern innovation, but an ancient necessity. What made Gopala's systems revolutionary wasn't their complexity, but their humility. While Roman aqueducts forced rivers into submission, his structures worked with nature's rhythms. Take the stepwells of Mauryan cities. These weren't just water sources, but microclimates. Their descending terraces cooled the air, creating natural refrigeration for food storage while providing sanctuary for birds and medicinal plants. Even the bricks were engineered to filter impurities, turning monsoon runoff into drinkable water through nothing but gravity and clever geometry. Modern engineers call this biomimicry. Gopala called it common sense. His most enduring legacy, though, was the Jalayantra, a rainwater harvesting grid so efficient that villages using his methods today still outlast their neighbors during droughts. Farmers in drought-prone regions of Rajasthan still rely on his funnel-shaped tanks, which capture every droplet from brief seasonal showers, channeling them into aquifers rather than letting them evaporate. The irony, while contemporary cities pump groundwater until the earth collapses, Gopala's 2,000-year-old blueprints offer a solution we're only now rediscovering. Yet history nearly erased his contributions, folding them into Ashoka's achievements. The reason reveals an uncomfortable truth. We remember kings who proclaim ideals, not the advisors who make them practical. Gopala's water systems spread across Asia, adapted by Buddhist monks and Hindu temples, yet his name vanished from the records. Even the Arthashastra, the famed ancient Indian treatise on statecraft, mentions his techniques without crediting their creator. That oversight costs us more than historical accuracy. It obscures a vital lesson. Gopala's work forces us to reconsider what advanced really means. His cities lacked concrete skyscrapers but mastered something far more critical: resilience. When modern engineers examined his flood control channels, they found gradients calculated to millimeter precision, aligning with seasonal rain patterns modern meteorology confirms. His designs required no pumps, no fossil fuels, just an intimate understanding of wind, slope, and soil. In an age obsessed with technological supremacy, his legacy whispers a provocative question. What if progress isn't about conquering nature, but conversing with it? The answer might just lie in the silent wisdom of a man who knew that the truest monuments aren't carved in stone, but woven into the land itself. Athens in the 5th century BCE was a city that worshipped wisdom, as long as it came from the right mouth. Enter Aspasia of Miletus, the foreign-born thinker whose salon became the intellectual heartbeat of the Golden Age, yet whose legacy was nearly suffocated under the weight of gendered lies. While Socrates and Plato dominate philosophy textbooks, few realize it was Aspasia who schooled them in rhetoric, ethics, and the art of persuasive speech. Her home wasn't just a gathering place for Athens' elite. It was a laboratory for democracy itself, where Pericles refined his funeral oration and playwrights tested radical ideas about justice. But here's the twist: the same men who absorbed her wisdom in private publicly dismissed her as a mere courtesan, reducing a philosopher to a punchline in the comedy of Athenian patriarchy. What made Aspasia's influence so dangerous to the establishment wasn't just her gender, it was her method. Unlike the formal academies where men debated abstract ideals, her salon thrived on cross-disciplinary exchange. Poets, generals, and sculptors sat elbow to elbow, their conversations blending politics with drama, mathematics with morality. This was philosophy in action, not ivory tower theorizing. When Pericles introduced policies granting unprecedented rights to Athenian women, the fingerprints of these discussions were all over them. Aspasia's arguments for equality weren't abstract musings. They were blueprints for legal reform, woven into the fabric of the city's governance. Yet the moment those ideas left her lips, they became Pericles' genius, not hers. The slander campaign against her reveals the playbook still used to silence outspoken women today. Comic playwrights like Aristophanes painted her as a seductress manipulating men through sex, not reason. Historians whispered that she'd trained courtesans in rhetoric, framing intellectual mentorship as a brothel's curriculum. Even Plutarch, writing centuries later, couldn't resist titillating anecdotes about her influence over Pericles, as if a mind that sharp needed the bedroom to sway opinion. The strategy was brutally effective. By sexualizing her brilliance, they made it impossible for Athenian society to take her seriously as a thinker. Yet the cracks in this narrative are everywhere if you know where to look. Socrates himself, in Plato's Menexenus, credits Aspasia with composing Pericles' most famous speeches, even joking that he'd learned rhetoric by hanging around her. Fragments of her teaching survive in the works of other philosophers, recycled without attribution. The most damning evidence of her erasure, the sheer panic in her detractors' voices. When a woman's ideas are trivialized with that much ferocity, it's usually because they're anything but trivial. Aspasia's story isn't just ancient history, it's a mirror. The same tactics used to undermine her resurface every time a woman's expertise is dismissed as nagging, her ambition as ruthlessness, her success as the result of connections rather than competence. The difference is we now have a word for what happened to her, the credibility gap. It's the chasm between what women actually contribute and what they're allowed to claim. 2,000 years later, we're still fighting to close it. But here's the solace Aspasia offers: ideas outlive slander. However hard they tried to bury her legacy, they couldn't erase the fact that the brightest minds of antiquity lined up to learn at her door. And that's a truth no amount of scandal could silence. The fall of Babylon in 689 BCE wasn't just the collapse of a city, it was a cultural apocalypse. Assyrian soldiers smashed temples, burned libraries, and systematically erased the intellectual heritage of Mesopotamia. But in the chaos of smoke and screams, one woman moved with quiet purpose. Bel-Shalti-Nana, a high priestess of the moon god Nana, wasn't just saving herself, she was smuggling the soul of a civilization. Under her robes, she hid cuneiform tablets, poems, star charts, legal codes, each one a thread in the tapestry of human thought. While conquerors celebrated their victory, she staged history's first known library evacuation, proving that knowledge, when guarded by the right hands, is far harder to destroy than walls. What drove her to such audacity? This wasn't mere sentimentality. In ancient Mesopotamia, tablets weren't just records, they were sacred contracts with the gods. Losing them meant losing the very instructions for existence, how to predict floods, cure illnesses, or honor the divine. Bel-Shalti-Nana understood something the Assyrians didn't. You can raise a city, but if its words survive, its heart still beats. Her journey to exile wasn't a retreat, it was a relocation of memory. Hidden among refugee caravans, she transported tablets to sympathetic scribes in and Uruk, who copied them in secret. Some were baked into clay jars and buried, waiting for comma times. Others traveled as far as Egypt, carried by merchants who'd never know the value of their cargo. The genius of her operation lay in its simplicity. No grand conspiracies, just a network of priests, potters, and traders who understood that culture outlasts kings. She didn't just preserve epic poetry like Gilgamesh, she saved practical knowledge too. Agricultural manuals ensured future harvests. Medical texts contained the world's first documented prescriptions. Even recipes for beer, Mesopotamia's staple drink, survived because of her. This wasn't just about the past, it was an insurance policy for the future. Centuries later, when Assyria itself fell, those rescued texts became the seeds of Babylon's rebirth under Nebuchadnezzar. Yet Bel-Shalti-Nana's true legacy isn't just in what she saved, but how. Her methods became a playbook for every librarian who followed. When the Library of Alexandria burned, scholars echoed her tactics, smuggling scrolls to monasteries. During World War II, curators at the Louvre used her burial strategy, hiding masterpieces in Shattuck cellars. Even today, archivists in war zones cite her as inspiration, packing manuscripts into vegetable trucks or digitizing them onto hidden servers. The irony, the Assyrians meticulously recorded their own conquests, never realizing their greatest adversary wasn't a warrior, but a woman who refused to let memory die. Her story forces us to confront a chilling question. How much of history is missing because no Bel-Shalti-Nana stepped forward? For every text she rescued, countless others turned to ash in Nineveh's fires. That's why her courage resonates so deeply now in an age where digital archives can vanish with a keystroke, where wars still target museums and universities. She reminds us that preserving knowledge isn't passive. It's an act of defiance. The next time you read a millennia-old poem or marvel at an ancient star map, remember, it might exist because someone, somewhere, once hid wisdom in their robes and walked through hell to deliver it. And that's a debt no civilization ever truly repays. When Rome teetered on the brink of economic ruin in the 3rd century, its emperors blamed barbarians or bad harvests, but the real enemy was invisible. Inflation had spiraled so wildly that soldiers demanded wages in sacks of grain rather than coins, and merchants bartered nails like currency. Enter Aurelius Achilles, the treasurer who saw what others refused to acknowledge. Rome wasn't being sacked by invaders, it was crumbling from within. While Emperor Diocletian would later become infamous for imposing price controls, a move historians love to mock as heavy-handed, it was Achilles who engineered the quiet revolution that actually worked. His genius wasn't in forcing prices down, but in rebuilding trust from the ground up. The heart of his strategy lay in something radical for its time: fiscal transparency. Where previous regimes had secretly debased coins, Achilles published minting records openly, allowing citizens to track the silver content in each denarius. Tax collectors, once notorious for arbitrary demands, now carried standardized scales to weigh payments, a small act that eliminated whispers of corruption. Most revolutionary of all, he tied provincial governors' salaries to local economic health, incentivizing them to invest in roads and granaries rather than hoard wealth. These weren't just policies, they were psychological masterstrokes. For the first time in generations, Romans could predict tomorrow's prices with some certainty, and that stability became the bedrock of recovery. Achilles' most enduring innovation, though, was his tax triangle, a system where villages collectively guaranteed one another's obligations. If drought struck one region, neighbors shared the burden rather than letting arrears cascade into unrest. This mutual responsibility created something Rome had lacked for decades: economic resilience. Within 5 years, the empire's currency stopped hemorrhaging value, and markets began functioning again, not because of imperial decrees, but because Achilles understood that trust moves faster than legions when repairing an economy. Yet history barely remembers him. Diocletian's edict on maximum prices, a desperate last resort after Achilles' death, overshadows his subtler reforms. The irony is painful. The emperor's failed intervention became a cautionary tale, while the treasurer's successful policies faded into administrative records. Part of the erasure was deliberate. Achilles refused to erect statues or inscribe his name on monuments, believing stability should speak for itself. But the deeper reason reveals a pattern we still see today. Societies idolize the crisis responders, not the architects who prevent disasters in the first place. What makes his story so urgent now is how it reframes our view of ancient economics. We imagine Rome's fall as inevitable, but Achilles proved decline wasn't destiny. It was a series of solvable problems. His tax triangle foreshadowed modern mutual aid networks. His currency transparency anticipated central banking principles. Even his governance incentives mirror contemporary performance-based economics. The lesson isn't just that he was ahead of his time. It's that solutions often exist long before we think to look for them. The real mystery isn't why Rome eventually fell. It's how much longer it might have lasted if more leaders had listened to the quiet man balancing the books. Centuries before Copernicus dared to suggest the Earth wasn't the center of the universe, a lone voice on the island of Samos shattered that cosmic arrogance with a single heretical idea. Aristarchus of Samos didn't just question geocentrism, he dismantled it with geometry, calculating the distances between the Earth, Moon, and Sun so accurately that his findings pointed to an inescapable conclusion: we orbit the star, not the other way around. His treatise on the sizes and distances might as well have been a match tossed into a room full of kindling. The backlash wasn't just swift, it was existential. How dare a mere mortal append the celestial order that gods and kings had spent millennia crafting? What made Aristarchus's work so dangerous wasn't just its brilliance, but its audacity to rely on evidence over tradition. Using lunar eclipses and angular measurements, he deduced the sun was vastly larger than Earth, a fact that made the notion of our planet anchoring the cosmos laughable. His contemporaries, including Archimedes, referenced his findings with a mix of awe and unease, as if acknowledging his correctness might unravel society itself. Even Ptolemy, whose geocentric model would dominate for 1500 years, admitted Aristarchus's math was sound before dismissing it as philosophically absurd. That phrase, philosophically absurd, reveals everything. When dogma can't refute facts, it pathologizes them. The real tragedy isn't that Aristarchus was ignored, it's how thoroughly his legacy was erased. Only one of his original works survives, a fragment on solar eclipses. The rest were likely purged by later scholars invested in Earth-centered cosmology. Christian and Islamic astronomers, building on Ptolemy's flawed system, scrubbed his name from their star charts. By the Middle Ages, his heliocentric model was treated as a curiosity, a dead-end idea from a misguided thinker. The irony: Copernicus himself credited Aristarchus in an early draft of On the Revolutions, only to remove the reference before publication, a small but telling act of self-censorship. Yet traces of his courage linger. In the margins of medieval manuscripts, scribes occasionally preserved his calculations as hypothetical exercises, unaware they were safeguarding revolutionary truth. Galileo, facing his own heresy trial, invoked Aristarchus as proof that persecution didn't equal error. Even NASA lunar missions used his 2,000-year-old geometric principles to navigate. That's the haunting lesson of his story. Genius isn't always lost. Sometimes it's suppressed, buried under layers of orthodoxy until someone digs it up and asks, why were we ever afraid of this? Aristarchus's fate forces us to confront an unsettling pattern. Progress doesn't just battle ignorance, it battles the systems that profit from ignorance. Priests needed Earth at the universe's center to justify their authority. Philosophers needed it to sustain their tidy cosmic hierarchies. The weight of those vested interests crushed a truth that could have spared humanity centuries of cosmological confusion. So when we celebrate Copernicus as a hero, let's remember he stood on the shoulders of a man who was pushed into the shadows. The true measure of Aristarchus's greatness isn't just what he discovered, it's how long the world resisted admitting he was right. The Nile Delta was burning. Assyrian forces under King Esarhaddon had smashed through Egypt's defenses, sacking Memphis and driving Pharaoh Taharqa into retreat. With the kingdom's fate hanging by a thread, an unlikely figure stepped from the shadow's Mentum hat, the Theban general who refused to accept that the war was lost. While court chronicles would later credit Taharqa's eventual resurgence to divine intervention, the truth was far more revolutionary. Mentum hat didn't just resist the Assyrians, he rewrote the rules of ancient warfare, pioneering tactics so effective that future generals would copy them without ever knowing his name. His strategy was born of necessity. Facing an enemy with superior numbers and ironclad siege engines, conventional battles were suicide, so Mentum had turned the desert itself into a weapon. His troops, lighter and faster than Assyrian heavy infantry, launched hit-and-run attacks from hidden wadis, disappearing into sandstorms before counterstrikes could land. They poisoned wells along invasion routes, forcing enemies to stretch supply lines thin. Most brilliantly, they exploited the Assyrians' greatest weakness, their reliance on centralized command. By targeting messengers and scouts, Mentum hat's forces severed the neural network of the army, leaving battalions blind and leaderless in hostile terrain. These weren't just skirmishes, they were masterclasses in asymmetric warfare, delivered 2,000 years before the term existed. The irony: these very tactics would later make Hannibal famous. When the Carthaginian general used the Alps to ambush Rome, historians marveled at his ingenuity, never realizing he was walking in Mentum hat's footsteps. The connection isn't coincidental. Greek mercenaries who fought under Mentum hat carried his methods across the Mediterranean, where they seeped into military academies Carthage would later study. Yet history remembers Hannibal's elephants, not the Nubian general who first proved that terrain and unpredictability could humble empires. Why the erasure? Because victory has many authors, but ingenuity often goes unnamed. Assyrian records, eager to frame their eventual withdrawal as magnanimity rather than defeat, ignored Mentumhat entirely. Later Egyptian scribes, loyal to Pharaoh, downplayed the general's role to uphold the myth of royal invincibility. Even Herodotus, usually so meticulous, reduced the conflict to exotic anecdotes about Ethiopian archers. The pattern is painfully familiar. When the marginalized outthink the powerful rewrite the story. Mentumhat's legacy isn't just in the battles he won, it's in the blueprint he left for every underdog who followed. From Vietnamese rice paddies to Afghan mountains, his core principles endure. Know your land better than your enemy, strike where they're slowest, and above all, make their strength their weakness. That his name faded while lesser tacticians became legends only proves his most enduring lesson sometimes. The greatest strategy of all is ensuring your ideas outlive your recognition. And in that, Mentumhat succeeded beyond measure. In the shadowy corridors of Persia's royal court, where whispers could topple kings, one man turned secrecy into an art form, Bagoas, the vizier whose real legacy wasn't poison but parchment. While history remembers him as the archetypal schemer, the truth is far more fascinating. He was the unsung architect of diplomatic espionage, a mastermind who used coded messages to protect Darius Roman III from assassination. Picture this, a nobleman's innocent-looking letter, its surface praising the king's wisdom, but between the lines, invisible ink reveals a plot to stab him during a banquet. This wasn't just intrigue, it was innovation. Bagoas didn't just uncover conspiracies, he weaponized language itself, crafting ciphers so clever that even suspicious couriers couldn't detect them. His techniques read like a blueprint for modern intelligence agencies. To expose traitors, he'd plant slightly altered versions of the same encrypted order in different regions, then track which variant reached the conspirators. The discrepancies became a roadmap to leaks. He even devised a primitive form of steganography, hiding messages in the seemingly random patterns of woven carpets gifted to allies, a trick later echoed in World War II's microdot technology. Yet for all his brilliance, Bagoas's name became synonymous with betrayal, reduced to a cautionary tale about eunuchs and poison. The irony, the very tools he created to stabilize Persia were twisted into evidence of his treachery by historians who couldn't fathom a courtier wielding such power honorably. Why does this misrepresentation matter? Because Bagoas's story reveals how easily marginalized figures get flattened into stereotypes. Greek writers, eager to paint Persia as decadent, fixated on his identity as a eunuch, framing his intellect as deviousness. The same cryptographic genius that saved Darius became, in their accounts, proof of underhandedness, as if only proper men could be loyal. This wasn't just slander, it was cultural warfare. By erasing his contributions to statecraft, they made Persian innovation seem derivative, reinforcing the myth that the West alone pioneered rational governance. Yet traces of his influence are everywhere. Roman spies adopted his cipher techniques, medieval Arab cryptographers refined them, and Renaissance diplomats resurrected his methods verbatim. Even today, intelligence academies teach principles Bagoas codified: the value of misinformation campaigns, the importance of compartmentalizing sources, the art of turning enemy networks against themselves. His true legacy isn't in the palace intrigues he may or may not have orchestrated, but in the quiet revolution he sparked, one where information, not just armies, decided empires' fates. The tragedy isn't that Bagoas was villainized, it's that we lost the chance to see antiquity's spycraft through his eyes. While Sun Tzu gets credit for ancient strategy, Bagoas was the one who proved knowledge could be both shield and sword. Every time a modern agent intercepts a terrorist plot or a diplomat decrypts a rival's communique, they're walking a path he paved. And that's the ultimate twist. The so-called poisoner may have saved more lives through his codes than any vial ever took. History might have buried his name, but his craft is immortal, hidden in plain sight, just like his best messages. Athens in the mid-5th century BCE sparkled with the promise of democracy, but that promise was almost strangled in its cradle by the iron grip of the Areopagus. This shadowy council of ex-archons, dominated by aristocratic families, held veto power over the people's assembly, turning supposed rule by the masses into a carefully staged illusion. Enter Ephialtes, the firebrand reformer whose name should be etched alongside Cleisthenes in the annals of liberty. While Cleisthenes laid democracy's foundations, it was Ephialtes who tore down the final barriers, stripping the Areopagus of its political teeth and handing real power to the assembly, the courts, and for the first time ordinary citizens. His reforms didn't just tweak the system, they ignited a revolution so radical that within months he paid for it with his life. The brilliance of Ephialtes' strategy lay in its surgical precision. Where others had chipped meekly at aristocratic privilege, he struck at its jugular judicial corruption. By transferring the Areopagus's power to try high-profile cases to popular courts, he didn't just redistribute authority, he exposed the rot festering beneath Athens' gleaming facade. Suddenly, wealthy elites could no longer buy verdicts behind closed doors. Trials became public spectacles, with juries of hundreds drawn by lot from the citizenry. The effect was electric. For the first time, a dockworker's vote carried the same weight as a landowner's. But Ephialtes knew the stakes. On the eve of his reforms, he reportedly slept in the assembly hall, guarded by supporters armed with clubs, a stark foreshadowing of the violence to come. His assassination remains one of antiquity's most consequential unsolved crimes. The knife-wielding assailants vanished into the night, leaving behind a trail of deliberate obfuscation. No trials followed, no conspirators were named. Even the motive was sanitized, with later historians implying the murder was personal rather than political. The timing, though, screamed the truth. Ephialtes fell precisely as his reforms began to bite, his death creating a vacuum swiftly filled by his protege Pericles, a man far more palatable to the elite. Here's the bitter irony: Pericles' golden age, celebrated as democracy's zenith, was built on Ephialtes' blood, yet his mentor's name faded into obscurity. The erasure was systematic. Surviving speeches from the period mention Ephialtes only in passing, often to credit his reforms to Pericles instead. Even Aristotle, usually meticulous, glossed over his murder in a single cryptic line. The message was clear. Athens wanted to remember its democracy as a seamless evolution, not a hard-fought battle against its own oligarchic instincts. But the cracks in this narrative are everywhere. The very vehemence with which later orators denied Ephialtes' importance betrays their discomfort. Why protest so much unless his legacy still threatened someone? What makes his story so urgent today is how it mirrors democracy's perpetual fragility. Ephialtes proved that voting rights alone aren't enough. Real power lies in who controls the mechanisms of justice. His assassination reminds us that elites rarely surrender privilege willingly. Sometimes they sharpen daggers, and his erasure, a cautionary tale about who gets to write history. We celebrate Pericles' funeral oration, but the true epitaph of Athenian democracy belongs to the reformer who dared to make its promises real only to be struck down for it. His name may have been scrubbed from the marble, but his lesson endures. Every golden age has its ghosts, and the brightest are often those deliberately forgotten. The waves of the Aegean churned with blood and fire as 300 Greek ships closed in, but one vessel stood apart. its commander cutting through the chaos with icy precision. Artemisia, Eye of Carrier, wasn't just the only woman admiral in Xerxes' navy. She was its sharpest tactician, a ruler who turned her 5 ships into a legend. While Persian and Greek forces clashed at Salamis, Artemisia did the unthinkable. When trapped by an Athenian trireme, she ordered her crew to ram her own allied ship, flying the Carian flag as a decoy. The Greeks, assuming she'd switched sides, let her pass. Xerxes, watching from shore, reportedly exclaimed, "My men have become women, and my woman has become a man." The moment captures the paradox of her legacy, a leader celebrated for brilliance, then vilified for the crime of not fitting history's mold. What made Artemisia's command so revolutionary wasn't just her gender, it was her grasp of psychological warfare. Where Persian admirals relied on sheer numbers, she exploited the Greeks' expectations. By feigning retreats or hoisting enemy colors, she turned their own tactics against them. Her most daring move came during the chaotic retreat from Salamis, when she sailed straight through the heart of the Greek fleet. Her ship's hull scraped raw from near misses. Survivors later claimed she'd shouted orders in perfect Attic Greek, mocking pursuers as she vanished into fog. These weren't the actions of a mere figurehead. They were the strokes of a strategist who understood that war is as much theater as combat. Yet history's ink turned against her with stunning speed. Greek historians, unable to reconcile her Persian allegiance with her prowess, recast her as a traitor to her sex and homeland. Herodotus, while admitting her genius, framed her as an exotic oddity, dwelling on her masculine ruthlessness rather than her naval innovations. Later Roman writers went further, inventing tales of her drowning a lover to prove her monstrous nature. The subtext was clear: a woman who outmaneuvered men must be either unnatural or evil. Even modern retellings often reduce her to a seductress, as if strategy and sexuality couldn't coexist in one mind. The real scandal of Artemisia's story isn't her alleged betrayal, it's how nationalism dictates who gets remembered as a hero. The same Greeks who vilified her celebrated Themistocles for similar cunning, simply because his tricks served their side. Persian records, meanwhile, minimized her contributions to avoid acknowledging dependency on a Carian vassal. Both cultures had a vested interest in erasing her. She exposed the flimsiness of their gendered and political hierarchies. A queen who ruled her own city-state, who advised Xerxes against invading Greece, correctly predicting disaster, and whose tactics were later studied by Alexander's admirals, didn't fit anyone's preferred narrative. Her legacy lingers in the unlikeliest places. Byzantine naval manuals preserved fragments of her formations, though her name was scrubbed. Ottoman sailors whispered of a witch of the waves who could vanish into storms, likely a distorted echo of her exploits. Today, scholars peel back the slander to find a pioneer of maneuver warfare, a leader who grasped that sometimes survival means breaking every rule, including the ones about who gets to write history. The next time you hear of Salamis, remember, the battle's most fascinating figure wasn't a Greek or Persian, but the woman both sides tried to forget, simply because she refused to be anything less than extraordinary. These 20 forgotten visionaries didn't just live in history, they whispered to the future. The scribe who saved knowledge from flames, the general who outwitted empires with sand and wind, the philosopher who dared to place the sun at the center of the cosmos. Their lives shatter the myth that only kings and conquerors move the world forward. Think about the last history class you took, whose faces filled the pages, likely emperors, warlords, men whose power came from armies or birthright. But the healers who pioneered medicine, the engineers who turned rainwater into lifelines, the poets who stitched fractured cultures together, they shaped our present just as profoundly, often with nothing but their minds and their refusal to accept, this is how it's always been. The real tragedy isn't that these figures were overlooked in their own time, it's that we continue to overlook them today. Textbooks still prioritize the drama of thrones over the quiet revolutions in workshops and sick rooms. When we reduce history to a parade of rulers and battles, we miss the deeper truth. Progress is a mosaic, and its most vital tiles are often the ones left unsigned. Imagine how many more breakthroughs might have flourished if the world had listened to the voices it dismissed women like Agnotis, who disguised herself to practice medicine, or Thino, whose math illuminated nature's hidden patterns. Their exclusion wasn't just unfair, it slowed the very advancement of knowledge. This isn't about rewriting history to be politically correct. It's about seeing it fully, without the filters of ancient propaganda or modern bias. Every time we dig up a story like Enheduanna's, the priestess who used poetry to unite empires, or Gopala's, the engineer who turned monsoons into lifelines, we're not just correcting the record. We're reclaiming tools for our own challenges. Artemisia's naval tactics could inspire leadership today. Horweneffer's bilingual bureaucracy holds lessons for multicultural societies. The past isn't a static relic, it's a toolbox, and we've been working with half the tools missing. So here's the invitation: look closer. Behind every great man narrative, there are countless others who built the stage he stood on. The next time you visit a museum or scroll through a historical documentary, ask yourself, who's not in this picture, whose innovations were credited to someone else? Whose resistance was erased because it unsettled the powerful? The answers might surprise you, and they'll definitely change how you see the world. History isn't finished. It's waiting to be rediscovered, one overlooked hero at a time. Your curiosity is the key. Who will you uncover next?